back onto the 659 today. And the first thing I need to do is undo two things I did wrong last time. The first one was I put 45 Newton meters on there, which is what I would normally do that nut to, but later bikes it's 55. So I might knock the lock washer off, pull it up to 55 and see how much it actually moves. Then I'll back it off and do a straight pull to 55, which might end up tighter than just pulling that from 45 to 55. And the second thing to do is move this idler gear down because it has a washer under it. And at the moment, the idler gear is a little bit too high. To get the nut off, because it's got a whole lot of Loctite on it, I need to heat it up first. So that's the first thing I'll do. Set timer for 1 minute. That's a couple of minutes, should be long enough. Oh, that's really hot. The right way. I'll wait for the compressor to build up. Try it again. Wow. It is moving. When the air compressor goes off, I'll hit it again. Getting there. And it's off. That's why I use the green Loctite. Even with all that heat and the big rattle gun. If you're going to use a rattle gun this size, the main thing you need is big flow fittings and big flow hoses. Without the big flow, it just slows them right down. It probably looked like that was pretty slowed down, but it was just really locked on, which is good. You don't want them coming off. I might just stand it up. If I brush all the debris off with it standing up, it's not going to end up inside there so easily. Thread file onto it. I think it's a 150 pitch. 125. It's a 1. I'm just using the thread file just to take some of the Loctite out of the threads. Well, that was far more work than I was anticipating. I thought it would be easier than that. So the two things I want to do, the first is remove the washer that's underneath this gear and put it on top of the gear. Off. Oily fingers and gloves. There we go. Washer under circlet. The second thing I'm going to do is just knock this lock washer off. So what I'll try for a start is increasing the torque from 45 to 55, seeing how much it moves. And then start again. And see where it ends up. This is 55 Newton meters. Our tooling to hold it. And it moved a little bit. Not a great deal. Sounds like Rick's really getting into it today. Undo that. Now we'll go a straight pull to 55 and see what we get. Maybe a little bit more. And just bend the lock washer up again. Probably need to go somewhere else again, don't I now? Maybe we'll go over this side. Running out of fresh sections of lock washer to bend. Yep. So the original mark's still in the right spot, so the lock washer hasn't moved. And it has pulled up a little bit. So whether it needs 55 over 45, I don't know. Whether it was worth the effort of pulling it apart, well, that was more important to me than the extra 10 Newton meters on there, frankly. Just wipe this down again. Got a bit of oil in there. Get rid of that. Take the rag. That's back on. Thread's clean. You can see the idler gear has dropped down the teeth on the starter motor a little bit, which is nice. I might actually let the flywheel and bits cool down a bit before I refit them, because they are still fairly hot. I'd rather have it all cold, so that way it torques cold instead of torques against things that are possibly expanded a little bit. Maybe not quite so much Loctite last time. Although I've never had that much trouble getting one off before. And certainly I don't put them on to make them easy to get off. I put them on so they stay there. Okay, so that's our two things fixed. I finally got my replacement output shaft seal, which I had stolen the one I had for my bike and used it for someone else's, so I had to wait for my replacement to come in. And because Ducati have closed their Australian parts warehouse, pretty much everything's 4 weeks plus, which is really quite frustrating these days. You want anything, you order it and you wait. And a little plastic bag for that shaft. So just use a plastic bag on the shaft as a seal runner, if you like. Okay. Just to protect the seal from the splines on the shaft. This is just a plastic bush, little edge machined on it, and a knocker. It knocks in until the plastic edge sits on the case. I've been making quite a few of these sort of tools recently. I figured after nearly 30 years it was time to get some serious little tools. And it is really nice when you can just do that like that. Almost makes you look professional. Next thing I was going to do is assemble the alternator cover, which I stripped off to paint, bead blasted it all, primed it and put some VHT engine black on it. It's just a matte black or a satin black. It's surprising though how much rougher it looks with that paint on it than the original factory paint. It looks really bad. If I had known it was going to look this bad, I would have knocked some of the lumps off it. It's quite surprising. This is the alternator cover off the little 659. I stripped it back and painted it. I was going to say a year ago, but I reckon it's probably 2 or more now. Unfortunately, looks like I've scratched it a little bit in the time since. It's so long ago that the tape that I'd masked all the bolt holes up with had stuck there. I had to scrape it all off. So instead of it being a nice sandblast finish, it's now a scraped with razor blade to get rid of rubbish finish. I just hate the finish that you get if you just paint them. At the factory, when they're new, Ducati paint them and then they machine everything. So painted with all the machine surfaces bright is how it should be, and it's just a look that I like personally. So I'm going to dress the cover up. First thing to do is put the bearing in. The bearing is a 6003 TN9C3. SKF speak for 6003 plastic cage C3 clearance. And traditionally Ducati fit them with the balls showing to this side. And what happens is oil comes out the middle of the crank into this cavity here, and that's what lubricates the bearing. And then the oil flows back through the back of it. And there's actually a sort of a cast-in relief there, which I guess lets oil back past the bearing, but I can't imagine that it would hold that much oil in there. Don't know. Anyway, we'll just heat this up, then put the bearing in. Set timer for 2 minutes. It's getting too hot to hold, so I might leave it at that. There we go. And on the later ones, there's a circlip. Not sure when the circlip first appeared, possibly with the 3-phase engines in about 98, but earlier ones certainly don't have a circlip. I did a peso last week and there was no circlip. So that's our bearing in. I'll just let the cover cool down, and then I will put the alternator in. Cover's cooled down, so now I'll put the alternator in. So I'll just put a little bit of Loctite in the screw holes first. This is a 3-phase alternator, 3 wires. Put it in with the wires at the bottom and just line the bolt holes up so that the cord, the rubber on the cord, ends up in about the right place. Put a little bit of locky on the bolts, the locky that was sitting there. And they're a 6mm bolt, so they get 10 Newton meters. Take the annoying extension out. I always check these bolts whenever I have an alternator cover off, just in case. Years ago at Moto 1 we did a flywheel swap on a 996, I think. And then a little while later the bloke rang up, he was from a fair way away, and said that these bolts had come out and made a mess of it all, and he was angry we hadn't tightened those when it was apart, which is one of those things sometimes you don't think of doing things that aren't part of your actual job, but it's one of those things I always do these days. If I have one of these off, I always check the bolts underneath here, just in case. This is the wire guide. These are just 5mm screws, so they go to 8 Newton meters, and again Loctite, because you don't want this stuff coming out. If we go to 8, sometimes it just feels like it won't. Might get a smaller one and go to 7. This is the torque wrench I usually use for clutch spring bolts. Preset to 7. We'll see how we go with this one. That'll be enough with Loctite. So that's the alternator cover reassembled. I didn't remove the seal for the gear shift shaft. I just taped it all up. I've damaged my paint bashing it against there, which is really annoying. I'll have to touch it up at some point, but I'm not going to do that before I put it on, because I'm a little bit over it. These are the 2 locating dowels that I removed when I repainted this cover and the engine. They go in there. I'll put these in the engine case, and then I'm going to goop the cover up and then slam it on. But I've got some other stuff to do first before I get that far. So now I'll put the alternator flywheel assembly back on. Everything's nicely cooled down. The master groove, if you like, spin it around, is just there. That's what I'll line the dot up with, although, as I've said before, on these it's kind of meaningless because it doesn't actually correspond with anything. Make sure that washer's in the right spot, which it has to be. It is. Here we go. Let's line the starter gears up, and that's down. Now the starter gear height. The idler gear here is much better height with that washer on top of the gear under the circlip. I've got our flat washer. And the crank nut. So now we go to Loctite again. Maybe not quite so much as last time. Well, I'm certainly not unhappy that it was particularly hard to get off, because that's realistically how you want it. You don't want it to come off easy. Call that enough. Just a touch of oil around the outside edge of the nut. And the end of the crank's been all brake cleaned and cleaned down, so screw the nut on. Get the holding tool in and put 270 on it again. I'm going to locate the holding tool a little differently this time to see if it helps me pull the torque up a bit easier. Great. Oh, maybe not. No. Looks like I'm back to the old fork tube. These the little screw heads that aren't round cap heads just don't make this tool sit as nicely as it usually does. But it's on 270. It's tight. Everything spins as it should. So happy with that. One thing I'm going to do before I put the cover on is I'm going to check the rotation sensor gap. This is the sensor, little Bosch sensor. They started using this location for the 1098s. Originally they used the older sensor and then they went to this one. Anyway, there's meant to be a couple of O-rings in there that I'm still waiting for, so they aren't in yet. But I'm just going to pop the sensor in, then see what the gap is, because there isn't any adjustment really on these. I've never seen one with a shim in it, and Ducati certainly don't seem to shim them, they just bolt them in. So I'm curious to know what the gap is. Guessing around about 0.7 or 0.8. That's a 0.8. 7.5. 7. 6.5. There you go. 0.65. And that's just fine. And when the gear comes around, there, you can see that the teeth of the gear are cut out, and so the sensor part, which is just right in the middle of it, right there, it's a magnet, the end of this bolt sticking to, that is where the cutout is, and that cutout tells the ECU where in the cycle the engine is. So it works out its sequence. So 0.65 is nice. At this point, the cover can go on because I can't think of anything I haven't done. That's locked up nice and tight. Idler washer's in the right spot. That's at 55 Newton meters now. The gear shift's set up. The starter motor's all tight. There isn't anything else to do that I can think of. Hopefully I haven't forgotten anything. There is a screw that goes in here, being a wet clutch or a late wet clutch engine. This screw they started, I think, with the wet clutch in the big blocks, which was the ST3 2005, and it regulates oil pressure being supplied through the centre of the input shaft where the clutch push rod goes to the wet clutch. This engine's going to get dry clutched, but I'm not going to be using a shaft across the engine. I'm going to be using this rather gorgeous piece from Red Fox Grinter, which bolts on and there's a lever on here and it uses a cable. And so it pulls the pressure plate off the engine. So I don't need a push rod going across. So I'm going to block that hole off with the plug that they use on the 821 Monster, which is a plastic plug that screws into the alternator cover, has a couple of O-rings like a clutch push rod does, and it goes in there. So I'm not sure what I need to do with that as yet. I still will want oil going into the centre of the input shaft because it supplies bearings that are in there, and it supplies the centre of the primary drive gear. And the clutch nut I'm using is this, which is just a solid nut. Well, it's an original nut with a hex piece welded onto it, so I can tighten it up. So there's no chance of any oil getting out. Well, hopefully not. I'll probably put an O-ring maybe in the end of it against the shaft just to seal it up. So there's no chance of oil getting out the other end, but I don't know what I need to do with that as yet. So next thing to do is to put the goop on the cover, find all the screws I'm going to use, put the dowels in, put it on. I'm using the original 659 bolts, but I had them all yellow zinced or gold zinced. And I had to buy a few more because some of the original ones on these engines have a boss and a thread inside them to bolt a cover onto the side of the engine. I've just got to work out which ones I actually need as it goes together. So I'm just going to goop up the alternator cover. Usual, just dab the sealant on and then dab it out with my finger. This is my preferred method for doing this. Some people use a brush, I believe. Just squeeze the start of this tube out and mix it up because it tends to separate for some reason. This tube is particularly bad. Some tubes don't ever do it. This tube seems to do it a lot. I don't go through a lot of the 3 bonds, so it takes a while. When I get around to the rubber grommet on the alternator wiring, I'll just lift it up, put a little bit underneath it, and then put it back in again, and that's usually enough to seal them. They don't need a lot of sealant around them. This out, A little bit of sealer in there behind that. And then back in again. And a little bit of sealant on the rubber itself, but doesn't usually need much in my experience. Just make sure I'm happy with the coverage all the way around. There we go. Now let that sit for a little bit, and while it's sitting, I'll get everything else prepped. The first thing I would do is just give the face of the crankcase its final wipe. I usually goop the cover because if you've got it in the bike all assembled and the cover's off for a starter clutch replacement or something, it's always easier to goop the cover than it is to goop the crankcases. So that's nice and clean. Our two locating dowels, one in there and one there. To get these out, I ended up putting screwing a tap into them of whatever was appropriate, maybe an 8 or something like that, and then you can pull them out much easier than any other way of getting them out. The next thing I'll do is just, should have done this before I did the clean, is to spray some HHS 2000 in the holes. They will pick up some goop as the screws go in, so the threads won't be dry because there'll be some of the 3-bond come in with the screws, so they are lubricated to some extent just with the 3-bond. But doing this just makes me feel a little bit better. Again, it might not actually do anything, but if you do the things that make you feel better about it, you're going to be happier with your job. And I think that's about it, really. The screws that go in here, usually these two are 30mm long, and these ones around the outside are 25, and the two under the clutch cover are 20s. But when I put it on, I'll see what it wants where. Usually put some threaded rod in those two, and that helps guide the cover on as it goes down. If it's a water-cooled engine, which this isn't obviously, the water-cooled engine has a shaft that comes up here, and it has a slot in the end of it which drives the water pump. To make it easy to get that to line up, I usually line up the slot with the center of the crank. So the slot would be sort of like so, pointing at the crank, and then the cover, you line up the same in the cover, and usually they just go straight on. That's just the easiest way of doing it in my experience. I generally don't put anything on the gear shift shaft to protect the seal. Possibly you could if you wanted to. Again, whatever makes you feel good about the job you're doing. It's never been those seals just don't ever leak. I don't think I've ever replaced one for leaking. I think actually my 400 Super Sport leaked, and I put a new seal in it, and it still leaked. So I think I ended up putting an O-ring between the gear lever and the seal and jamming it up, and that stopped it leaking, which is a bit low rent, but it worked. Cover, threaded rod, threaded rod. And down we go. And that's it. I'm really disappointed about the paint on that cover, but it's one of the VHT heat paints, and usually it goes off when the engine gets hot, which means that until the engine's been run, it's possibly a bit soft. And I'm guessing that's why it's done that. That's why I like to, if I'm getting engines painted, I usually prefer to give it to a pro and get everything 2-pack, because when you get it back, it's hard. You can't damage it. You can't do that. So these are two 30mm screws that should go in our screw holes with the dowels. These are 25s, which all have about, looks like they're sticking out about 11, 12 millimeters. I quantify that properly. That's about 9. That's a good 10. Good 10. So they're all about 10 mil out, which is good. Okay, that's all of my 25s. I thought I had more 25s than that. That's very disappointing. These are the 20s, which will go there, but can't really go there. That sucks. I'll see if I can use a 30. I'll see at which point the thread bottoms out. Maybe the threads at the bottom of the engine might be deeper than the threads at the top. I'll see. Otherwise I'll buy some more 25mm screws and send them out and get them plated. Which I thought I'd handle. See how it goes. Looks like it bottomed out. Yep. Well, maybe they are okay. And 6mm screws, so 10 Newton meters. And I actually start at the front in the middle. And then go to the one at the clutch. The 30 is just fine. Compared to the older covers, these covers have an extra screw just here, near the pickup. I don't really understand why. I'm not sure what the advantage would be of putting another screw up there. It's taking us a bit longer to get to the back. So now we just go around and check them all. Must be 14 in this cover. Strange that they moved. Usually once you've done everything, they shouldn't be moving again. So that one moved again. A bit strange. Let's make sure it spins. Yep. Still spins nicely, so I don't think there's any issue at all. So that's alternator cover on.